where we bring to you informed debate and discussion. Hello everyone and welcome to our Jean Monnet podcast. Today we're going to be talking about an incredibly timely subject, that of Ukraine, European integration and security. And today in the room we have four Collegium Civitas students. We have Oleh from Ukraine.
Hello.
We have Arda from Turkey.
Hello.
We have Non from Thailand.
Hello.
And Alisher from Kazakhstan.
Hi.
So an incredibly international bunch of people. Now, I say timely, and that's because over the weekend there was the Munich Security Conference. The conference is every year, and generally speaking, this is a forum where controversy, where debate, where discussing about the future of European security and the world order is discussed amongst the good and the greatest, so to say. Now, this year, it was incredibly controversial. Clearly, we're still in the middle of a war in Ukraine. There's discussion over Gaza, and we had some really controversial speeches, especially from the American administration. And from my perspective, what this showed is that the Americans are very, very keen to link their domestic agenda with their foreign policy. And of course, a lot of it is rhetoric right now, but that rhetoric is incredibly strong. So, as I said, very, very timely. I'd like to go around the room first and foremost and just pick on people's initial impressions. Maybe you can say a few things about your country's perspectives from Munich and what was said. Oleh, you're from Ukraine, so please tell us what your reaction is to what was said in Munich at the weekend.
I think it was a really important conference, particularly this year, given we have conflict stage in Ukraine. And I would like just recall a few key statements that I heard in this conference and why they matters. I think one of the most important was that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for the creation of an army of Europe, given concerns that US may no longer come to the continent's aid. For instance, U.S. Defense Secretary P.T. Hegseth said that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a factory asset for NATO, what actually signaled the alliance need to be a new, maybe more robust, strong and real. So, but in contrast to this, Zelensky said that we cannot rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threatens it. So we need to be ready for such circumstances. And given Ukraine has a solid experience in war and our army is very advanced, it will be really also beneficial for Europe to build maybe a new form of coalition, a kind of army of Europe, in terms, in case US will deny for close military integration with Europe going forward.
Absolutely. And of course, today, in fact, there's a meeting, a so-called emergency meeting in Paris, where European leaders, or some of them at least, are meeting without their American colleagues, I gather, to talk about how Europe collectively can and should respond. So we're waiting for the end of the day to see what comes out of that. And I think what was interesting about many of Zelensky and his colleagues' comments is that people have responded saying that forget Trump, forget Brussels, actually it's Zelensky who is now the leader of the free world, and we should be listening to what the Ukrainian leader is saying about how Europe should respond and get on with things, basically. Let's stay in the region, and I'd like to ask Alisher, you're from Kazakhstan, a country obviously very, very close by to both Russia and Ukraine. What's been the response, if anything, from your country?
Thank you for this question. Well, I think that the response of Kazakhstan was more like balanced, because on the national level, like among the people, Kazakh society are of course criticizing Russia and saying that it's done bad things. However, the president also is pointing the opinion that this is really against the international law. Like the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, on the meetings was even Putin sitting next to him, telling him that this is really like unlawful to some extent, but using really political words. So of course with the aid to Ukraine, so I think the Kazakhstan is keeping this like balanced strategy, like sitting on both chairs at the same time, and like both helping, and with like the nation is more helping to Ukraine. However, the politics, economics are more like balanced, because they need to maintain the trade, and be careful because of their like region.
That's right, because I think that Russia and Kazakhstan have a fairly strong economics and trade relationship, and also obviously the Russian connection, the Russian world I know is pretty virile in your country too. Across the Black Sea, of course, there is Turkey, and am I right in thinking it's the same situation, that the Turkish government is keen to have a balanced approach and not speak out too loudly against Putin? Is that correct?
Yeah, so actually Turkey is using the balanced policies, and actually we can clearly say that Turkey is close to every countries like Russia, Ukraine, European Union, maybe China, all of them. So
it really is a kind of multi-vector policy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll be interesting to see as time goes by, and let's see what the Americans actually put into action, how far these balanced approach from Kazakhstan and Turkey and other countries, of course, actually change and become more sharp over time. Let's jump across the other side of the world. We have None from Thailand. It's really interesting for us to hear how a country seemingly so far away from this European security is responding, if in any way, about what's going on in Ukraine.
Well, I think from perspective of Thailand, we kind of gonna be compromised with like between like European Union and between Russia as well, because firstly we have to understand that we are like in Asia, which China is like the powerhouse over there. So we cannot just like how can I say, support like somebody's like more than somebody's and so on, which gonna for sure have like directly negative impact towards to our countries. So in short, I would say our country will just like keep everything in middle, just like compromise to everyone.
That's really interesting, and let's see how those different perspectives play out when these discussions about Ukraine's future, a peace settlement, if we can call it that, actually plays out in the United Nations debating chambers, let's say. Now, putting Munich to the side, because this is kind of fresh news, and we're going to have to see how it actually develops over time and how the Europeans respond to Trump's initiatives. We're also talking about how the European Union and European integration fits into Ukraine's future. Now, Trump and his band of merry men has already said that there's going to be no place for the Europeans at the negotiating table. Now, whether we agree with the rights and wrongs of that, I mean, personally, I think it's an absolute mistake. But I think it's for certain that, when it comes to implementing a peace agreement, rebuilding Ukraine's resilience, there's going to be a place for Ukraine's Europeanization. European integration might not bring fighting to a close, but I think for certain, if we look at history, European integration has always paved the way for a peace settlement, prosperity building, resilience, etc., etc. So I think we can safely assume that European integration and the EU is going to be a motor for Ukraine's future overall. So if European integration is, as we think in the room, an essential part of Ukraine's future, and perhaps even other countries in that eastern neighbourhood, we have to think, where did all that come from and where might it go to? Certainly we know that there's been a lot going on since 2022, the prospect of Ukraine and Moldova and maybe Georgia's membership, and in fact even now Armenia, has really appeared to the top of debates. And some politicians in the European Parliament, for example, but not just, have been arguing that, the time is ripe. Geopolitical factors suggest that Ukraine should be allowed a fast-track route into the EU rather than waiting around for 10 years or so to see, if it's actually really ready. And there's no guarantees with that. So I think there's a very clear argument and a convincing argument that Ukraine should be allowed this fast-track route in. But, as I mentioned, things didn't start just from 2022. And Oleh, you probably know better than all of us here about the background to that EU-Ukraine relationship. Where did it all come from and why? Because I think it's almost 10 years now since this relationship started to develop. And, of course, the country's path to the EU is part of domestic politics and it hasn't been straightforward, right?
Yes, but I would say that Ukraine set a strategy to integrate with EU and NATO since the presidency of Leonid Kuchma, who was second president of Ukraine since 1998, started from formal negotiations and intensified in 2007 when we had a pro-European elected president Viktor Yushchenko, and that's actually 2007 when formal negotiation for the EU association agreement has started. It covered areas like political dialogue, legal reforms, and economic cooperations, but it was more about to design the next steps to start this process. However, the significant will of Ukrainian society was displayed in 2013 and 14 after former President Yanukovych delayed signing the agreement and actually didn't sign this.
What actually happened to him? Because he was really prominent, he seemed to be a European, but that seems to have not actually occurred and he kind of disappeared somehow.
Yeah, I think originally he was always pro-Russian president, given he got a strong support in 2004 elections, where he was portrayed more as pro-Russian president versus Yushchenko, who was more pro-European, and he lost that elections, but he was re-elected in 2010. And actually, he was playing both sides. He formally he initiated some kind of reforms towards EU integration. However, there was very slow progress. And the EU had set conditions for reforms, including like judicial independence and electoral law. Also, to release a former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko from the prison, which was actually a major sticking point. Instead of working on this kind of reforms to meet the conditions, Yanukovych regime turned to Russia for financial support, what deepened public frustration and led to protests on Kyiv Square that we call today Revolution of Dignity.
And that was really closely tied to the European aspirations of Ukrainian people, right? There were two sides of the same coin.
Yes, we can say that in November 2013, after Vilnius summit, where Yanukovych didn't sign the EU association agreement and didn't meet the conditions for this, that day actually at the evening the demonstrations began, and it was a protest of public grievances centered on corruption, economic stagnations, and Yanukovych's alignment with Russia over Europe. So protests actually escalated. There were major victims, around 100 people killed, hundreds of injured people. People demonstrated over 2-3 months. And that regime actually understood that they don't have any power to mitigate the protests or to find the consent. And they, after deadly clashes in early 2014, Yanukovych was fleeing the country.
So this was a real punctuation point in Ukraine's relationship with the EU and Ukraine's relationship with Russia. And it seems that subsequent leaders realised that they can't kind of swing both ways, so to say. But, a European path was what the country deserved. And this obviously paved the way to all of these, deeper reforms that Ukrainian authorities were able to carry out. I know that, anti-corruption initiatives, but also didn't the EU offer out this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with Ukraine? In your opinion, was that a good thing? Has it led to some benefits, would you say?
Definitely. Particularly in the context of current war with Russia, it helped us to maintain trade at a high level so we can offset losses in trade through Black Sea channels blocked by Russia. And I would also emphasize that this agreement actually eliminated the major tariffs, and as of today, it's almost 99% goods are out of tariffs.
So basically, I think it seems that until 2022, when the when the war started and when Ukraine applied for EU membership, which we'll talk about, was greeted positively, already quite a lot was happening. But at the same time, it's very clear that the country still suffered from an oligarchic system. Oligarchs, it seems to me, they prop up a lot of these post-Soviet countries. The countries can't really live with them. They can't develop whilst you've got oligarchs, but it's difficult to exist without them because they're so, embedded into political, social and economic systems. Was anything achieved to tackle this oligarchic system? Well, first of all, tell us, why is oligarchy bad? And then, was there any effort to get rid of oligarchs prior to 2022?
Yes. So actually, the Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity symbolized the Ukrainian society determination to align with European values and reject oligarchs, authoritarianism, and lower the corruption level. So this was will of Ukrainian societies. On the other hand, our former politicians had close ties with oligarchs who influenced their political decisions for their own favor, for instance. And one of the main reasons it's undermined our democracy. It make Ukraine to have a poor economy and extra negative consequences. So if Ukraine determined to become a EU member in the future, it was the main challenge, obstacle that we have to overcome. And I would say, even though maybe at this moment we cannot say that we fully eliminated this problem or issue with oligarchs, however, many initiatives and reforms have been made in the recent years to lower oligarchs' influence in Ukraine. And
it's certainly from the EU side a big expectation that the country will, with the EU's help in fact, tackle the problem, let's say, or the reality of having a oligarchic system, because it benefits the very few. But we'll come back to many of the points that I know you want to bring up. But let's fast forwards a little bit. Again, as we remember, February, Russia, in an unprovoked way, invaded Ukraine, a sovereign country. And shortly after that, it was decided in Kyiv to put in a formal application for EU membership. This would not have been imagined a few years before. Obviously, the war was a catalyst, and quite rightly. And since 2022, we've moved really quite quickly towards Ukraine. It was a positive response from Brussels. Now it's going through the screening process. The details of how Ukraine could join the EU are already being mapped out. And as I mentioned before, quite a few countries are keen to see Ukraine jump to the top of the queue and to become a member sooner rather than later. And in the current discussion after Munich, I think there's an even stronger reason to consider that as a possibility. It seems the moral thing to do. Anyway, that's enough from me. So let's move over to Nun, because I know that things that you've been thinking about and working on are to do with the actual specifics of what it would take for Ukraine to be a member. We can all say, yes, Ukraine should be a member, but obviously the EU is this exclusive club, and there are lots of criteria. Straightforward question then. What is Ukraine required to do to become an EU member state?
All right. So with this question, I would first begin with let's say some kind of fundamental knowledge to all of us, even to the audience as well, to make more or less understanding of like what it is required to become, or in order to join the European Union. So in order to join a membership of EU, a country also must meet several criteria and also complete a structured process of reforms and also alignment. So these are the layout of Copenhagen criteria and the requirements for aligning with the EU law and standards.
And this is called the Copenhagen criteria, right?
Yes.
So these were created, over 20 years ago now. They were created just before or in light of the 2004 enlargement, to try and make sure that countries coming in, as you said, align with the politics, the economics, the legal, and the administrative criteria of this exclusive club. Very briefly, Oleh, looking at those Copenhagen criteria, is Ukraine anything close to them, would you say?
Yes, I think because there were plenty of reforms initiated and implemented to some kind of extent, and I can just mention, for instance, anti-oligarch law. In 2021, Ukraine adopted this law aimed to curbing the influence of big business on politics. So the law mandates the creation of an oligarch registry for individuals who meet multiple criteria, including ownership of significant businesses, media influence, and political involvement. Also, I would say that such reforms like decentralization, aiming to reduce administration fragmentation, empowering local governments, it also helps to combat corruption and make system more transparent. Also, a lot of digitalization projects, like we created application DIA, where you can perform many administration tasks without need to interact between people and the governments to avoid corruption and so on. So many of these projects help actually to meet the Copenhagen criteria and faster our progress to integrate with EU.
Yeah, certainly a lot's been done, and with a view to the Copenhagen criteria and the details of EU norms and laws. But I think it's very clear that even with great efforts, there's often a huge gap between the laws and the commitment and the will, and actually the change on the ground and a country's capacity to really implement all those very laudable and important goals. And just going back to so a country meets the basic criteria, let's say. The EU has broadly agreed that, Ukraine and in fact Moldova, the Republic of Moldova, has broadly met the Copenhagen criteria, yet there's a big path ahead of them, right? Yeah. So they've applied already, the screening process is now going on. What does that mean actually? What does it mean, the screening phase of accession?
In terms of screening the countries, is also mean like a country itself who apply for, let's say, an EU membership. They also have to meet like the acquis communautaire as well, which is simply can be translated into like EU law and standards. So these acquis communautaires can simply divide it into like 35 chapters, which going to be covering all areas of like EU policies, and also a candidate of countries also must align in its like legislation as well, policies, and also institution. So with these chapters, so here I can like briefly explain like some key major areas.
Yeah, I mean, we can discuss those together, really. So basically, 35 chapters, which is a lot, and as you said, it covers so many different areas.
Yes.
And everyone can come in on this if you want to. I know that Ukraine performs very well against some chapters. The European foreign policy. Ukraine is definitely in line with that particular negotiating chapter. But what are just very briefly, what are the real sticking areas for Ukraine? Where does it stumble? Alisher, your view on that?
Yes, I would like to talk about what are the most important problems on the horizon and opportunities. So first of all, let's talk about the challenges. They're like implementation of reforms. Ukraine must continue to implement fundamental reforms across various sectors to align with EU standards. There is a problem of rule of law and governance. And about the rule of law, I would like to talk a bit more. Because
everyone does talk about rule of law, governance, judicial reforms, tackling corruption, overcoming oligarchy. Why is that area so sticky, so difficult to reform, and why is it so important, do you think?
So in my opinion, the rule of law is really fundamental criteria for EU membership, ensuring that laws are applied consistently and fairly. So Ukraine faces significant challenges in this area, which impedes its EU integration. And there's also a problem of weak judicial system, and like Ukraine's judiciary has been criticized for efficiency, and we can also like refer to European Commission report that says that Ukraine is need for reforms to threaten judicial independence and efficiency. Also, talking about this EU Commission report again, we can talk about the corruption. The corruption is a problem, and the report also highlights that there has been some progress in anti-corruption efforts, but further work is really required to address these issues effectively. And we can even, compare this with other states, like for example Estonia, that when it got their independence, by the index of rule of law, so to say, or we can say that it was not on the first places or first 20 places in the world, but today the Estonia is taking 8th place in the rank of rule of law and how it's applied. So this is really good example how like post-Soviet country can take an example.
Yeah, so Estonia, and I think probably a number of other states as well, it does show how commitment, willingness, political will, but also that pathway provided by European membership and the prospect of that can help countries bring about those very deep and tricky reform areas. But, I think the problem is that Ukraine, in terms of rule of law, independent judiciary, has been allowed to fester and hasn't had that same reform impulse. Oleh, you're nodding your head. Tell us about the reality on the ground in Ukraine briefly.
I think as a Ukrainian, I acknowledge that our judicial system and reform still deserves to implement more steps to meet kind of expectations from the EU side. But I would also note some progress toward judicial reform since 2018 after President Zelensky came to power. There was established the Judicial Reform Commission, which actually recommends reforms to the judiciary, and the main proposed changes were to the selection process of judges, which is a really key point, actually, what EU asks. So to increase the accountability and transparency of Ukraine's courts. And this was actually a key element of Zelensky's broader anti-corruption agenda. What actually is good side to work on this actually path. And also, I would say that and there was created a Judicial Council of Ukraine, and it plays crucial role in selecting and evaluating judges. So the main principle is to select judges based on more merit-based criteria. So how much experience they have, quality, and the main point is that they were not involved in the past in any corruption or other kind of practices being in tight network to oligarchs. I think this is a really strategic point, but maybe we have war. It's the attention a bit switched to this situation, but I think the reform has right conceptions we have to implement.
Yeah, and I think certainly all those reforms, as Alisher and yourself mentioned, are going in the right direction. They're definitely addressing what the EU wants the country, and they're the right things. I mean, they're about accountability, they're about making institutions stronger. But as you mentioned too, the country is under martial law, and trying to push through these big systemic reforms is challenging anyway, and under war conditions even more so. And we shouldn't forget that there have been some massive corruption scandals recently in Ukraine. So, even with reform efforts, rooting out that culture is the next step. But at least they're aware of it. I think that before, leaders were denied that corruption existed,
Yeah, and just to add to your point, actually, to be aware about this. So we also have created, in parallel, anti-corruption bodies, like National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Investigation, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and National Agency on Corruption Preventions, which at this point maybe their role is more about collecting different corruption situations and cases and investigated them. And one day, I think, after we complete our judicial reform, we will have a very strong database to actually fight the corruption, what they done. And in particular, I think NABU have hundreds of high-level corruption cases collected, investigated, which focusing on public officials, politicians, and state agencies, including those in the centralized local governments.
I agree. Yeah, I think we all agree. It's important that all those, positive momentums are going on. But I think it is also the case, and it's partly because of the war and the incredibly difficult situation, that it takes a long time to bring a corruption case to court, but completely going in the right direction. So really big tasks ahead, and fingers crossed for Ukraine's leadership and people and institutions to bring about those changes. I mean, just as an interesting question, if such changes and systemic factors are not aligned with EU standards, what are the implications from the EU's side for Ukraine's future? I know that you've been thinking about these issues. Tell us what's at the forefront of your mind.
Well, I think EU is pretty much stressed about anti-corruption measures in Ukraine, and I actually did some kind of research, and it's pretty interesting, and I also wanted to share with you guys as well. So here with my conclusions, I have like 3 major areas, which is like why the EU like actually is super stressed about like anti-corruption measure in Ukraine. So first one is regarding economic stability and integration. So as everyone knows, corruption is negatively impact economics and also economic development and also foreign investment as well. It creates unfair business environment, discouraging competition and innovation as well. Also, since the EU operates as a single market, member states also need to maintain a high standard of financial accountability to ensure a fair competition and seamless economic integration. So that's the first point. Second one is efficient use of EU funds. EU membership entail access to substantial financial support through mechanisms like I'm sorry if I'm gonna pronounce it like incorrectly. So cohesion funds. Oh, okay. and agriculture subsidies. And also the other point is anti-corruption measures ensure that EU funds are used effectively and reach their intended purpose rather than being like siphoned off through fraudulent practices.
Yeah, I think you summed up all those factors really, really well. If you let any country, putting Ukraine aside, with unreformed institutions and policies, you run the risk of failure, or a country being constrained by EU laws but not really being ready. And I think you're also completely correct by pointing out the need for having a fair and open, competitive business environment, because if you don't have that, you're not going to have local entrepreneurs being able to build up their businesses and trade with the EU, which is the big idea, but you're also not going to attract foreign direct investment. And if we reflect back on Poland and Hungary and Czechia and the Baltic states, what helped them succeed in the 90s and 2000s was the way in which Western companies came in, built factories, and helped them to recover after that long and lengthy socialist or communist period. And the dream is that this will happen to Ukraine, so long as its institutions are reformed by local authorities, but also with the EU's help as well. And like we started at the beginning with the news from the Munich Security Conference, I think it's far from clear to see how the geopolitical situation is going to emerge and whether the US is actually committed to rebuilding Ukraine in an equitable European or Euro-Atlantic way. So thanks, Nan, for those comments. We've spoken about politics, society and economics in this framework, but we can't ignore the factor, of course, unfortunately, that Ukraine is still at war. Its eastern border is contested, to put it mildly. It's a country with real conflict and people dying on its territory. And, I think it's hard to see what that so-called peace agreement is actually going to lead to between Russia and the United States. So not only does Ukraine have these reform issues to deal with when it comes to EU integration, but the fact that it is still a country at war. How does that play out, Alisher, in the context of its EU membership? Can you imagine a country who is at war with Russia actually being, negotiating EU accession? Is this something totally new for the EU?
Yeah, well, this is a really good question. I think this is something totally new, but there have been the cases that are similar to this, and we can talk about the example of Croatia, the post-conflict state. And here I would like to talk that what is the difference between Croatia like before and in Ukraine today is that it's about post-conflict reconstruction. Croatia's EU accession process involved extensive post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation efforts, which were time-consuming and complex. Ukraine's situation is distinct, as it is currently engaged in active conflict, which presents additional challenges for reform and stability. And there's also another factor of EU-supported integration. Croatia's path to EU membership was supported by significant EU assistance aimed at rebuilding and stabilizing the country. While Ukraine has received substantial EU support, the ongoing war complicates the implementation of the reforms and the establishment of the stable institutions. And the last part I would like to add is about the security concerns. Unlike Croatia, which pursued EU membership as a means to secure peace and stability post-conflict, Ukraine's EU aspirations are influenced by immediate security concern due to ongoing war, affecting its capacity to meet EU accession criteria.
I think it's an important thing, a very obvious thing not to forget, but panning out back to the 1940s and 50s, we shouldn't underestimate how that Franco-German, France and German historical conflict, which led to war across the world, this was in part solved or mitigated or overcome by processes of European integration. And then, Poland and Germany were historical antagonists, and Poland joining the EU and NATO, of course, in 1999, then 2004, definitely contributed to overcoming that geopolitical tension at the heart of Europe. So the EU and European integration definitely has a strong and reliable history of helping countries overcome conflicts. Having said all that, I don't think the same logic can apply to Russia, because Russia is not a stakeholder committed to peace and committed to Ukraine's sovereignty in any shape or form. So there are limits to the way in which EU integration can be an advocate for peace, let's say. This is a really important topic, and I don't want to lose sight of it too much. Arda, what can you say about this topic? Maybe a little bit more from you.
Actually, first I want to talk about the historical context from past EU enlargements. The ascension of post-communist Central European countries such as Poland and Hungary offered additional insights into Ukraine's candidacy. So these countries underwent extensive reforms in areas like rule of law, maybe market liberalization or judicial independence before joining the EU. However, unlike Ukraine, they didn't face active conflict during their integration process, and Ukraine's ongoing war complicated this reform tragically and making the process more uncertain. So, moreover, the EU has grown more cautious in its enlargement policy due to internal challenges such as I said, rule of law, backsliding in some member states, and finally, which further complicates Ukraine's path. And another crucial point is institutional reforms. So a critical difference between Ukraine's candidacy and past cases like Croatia is the evolving nature of the EU's conditionality framework. So over the years, the EU has introduced stricter conditions on rule of law, judicial independence, which have become even more critical factors in the accession process. So in Ukraine's case, these reforms are essential, but ongoing conflict makes their implementation more challenging. So the EU has emphasized the importance of these reforms to strengthen democratic governance and stability in Ukraine.
I mean, we say that the EU and accession is going to be slow or slowed down, but having said that, Ukraine applied in 2022 for EU membership, and it was only a few months later that the EU turned around and said absolutely yes, and then kicked off the process, and it's been at a really accelerated speed so far. So I think we should, acknowledge that commitment, but of course how it pans out we don't know. The security issue and the ongoing war is obviously really, really critical and important, and we might want to twist the discussion around a little bit, and in light of the Munich conference, one of the maybe catalysts or outcomes from the war in Ukraine is that the EU might eventually, now, get its act together and create maybe not a European army, but create a stronger defence capacity. Individual EU and NATO states might raise their defence spending, and maybe, if we kind of nudge and find a place at the negotiating table with Trump and Putin, maybe the EU can be a more credible security actor and not just accept the plan that Trump will draw up, but contribute to Ukraine's future security. But we'll come back to that at the end of our discussion. Alisher, tell us.
I just
jump
wanted
in.
to add about the Munich conference. The Ursula von der Leyen there was just one quote about that I can announce that I propose to actively the escape clause for defense investment. This will allow member states to sustainability increase their defense expenditure. So the context is that member states need to invest 500 billion in the defense in coming decades, and they cannot negotiate in that. And this is like a new challenge for the EU right now. Yeah. And this is just how the EU representatives stress this, the topic you're talking right now.
Yeah, and I think the details of delivery and the reality of that is going to come clear today after this meeting in Paris, and maybe we can talk again at some point in the future about Europe's capacity, or not just political will, to actually play a security and defence role, potentially with boots on the ground, so to say, in Ukraine. So it's a really, complex and tricky issue. So, I mean, we've spoken about institutions, we've spoken about policies, but, what really is Europeanisation about? European integration has to involve people, because these are the most important thing, and civilization, we know that. And you can change institutions, you can put new leaders in place, but if you don't have civil society on board, it's arguably not going to be sustainable. Oleh, I'm going to go back to you, because you are our Ukrainian friend here in the room, and we really respect what you've got to say. It seems to me that public opinion on European issues in any country is important. We know, for example, here in Ukraine, that in the past, the government in Poland, for example, has been crazily Eurosceptic and a bit odd, let's be honest. But public opinion has always been really positive about European integration. I don't know how it is in Turkey. People, are they for integration, or are they
for the
silent
for the EU? For EU integration. So, the Syrian war and the refugee crisis is still growing in Turkey. So they are coming from every country, is like Syria, maybe Afghanistan. So these are the problem for the EU integration.
Yeah.
So for nowadays, I think it's impossible.
Yeah,
it's impossible.
Yeah. So the context isn't right. And it just shows, how important it is to think about public opinion then. What's the situation in Ukraine to do with that? Public opinion, society, are people behind this project, would you say? Can Zelensky rely on the people?
I agree that reforms and laws alone are not probably enough to transform a country. So, as a student of sociology, I would say that true changes come from societal shifts. We have, for instance, Ukrainian scientist Alexander Pashaver, famous economist, whose concept is that Ukraine have an active minority, which we could see during the protest of Orange Revolution, of Revolution of Dignity. Currently, during the war with Russia, they are Ukrainian soldiers, they are Ukrainian volunteers, and society who support army. But we also may have passive majority. And this passive majority have lasting effects on reforms, which actually depend on engaged civic participation. So, in comparison to other countries, like you mentioned, for instance, like transformation also takes some time for Poland because of its post-Soviet legacy. Ukraine even have longer history of integration with Russia or during being part of Soviet Union. What in result, this historical background lowered Ukrainians' level of civic engagement potentially, meaning that while an active minority pushes for European integration, much of society is still adapting to the culture of responsibility governance, rule of law, and civic activism necessary for these lasting reforms. And I can add that what we need actually this strong shift from a survivalist, state-dependent mindset inherited from the Soviet era to culture of personal responsibility and civic engagement. This is actually what Ukrainian society is moving towards, and I can say that ecosystem we have now, war, different revolutions, actually contribute to that societal change, that more people every time take more active, engaged part in the society, like I mentioned.
I mean, I think that sociological perspective, if I can say it correctly, is really important, and it's underlying and it's fundamental. So we should build that into our calculations and thinking, even if geopolitics seems to be the order of the day. I want to bring this discussion to a close. I think it's been really interesting, it's been timely, and hopefully we've been entertaining and interesting for people who have listened to this. Despite what Vance might say and despite what Trump might say, I think it's pretty clear that European integration is relevant. It might be slow. The EU might take ages to decide something. We might be a bit, timid when it comes to the use of force. But I think what the war in Ukraine has really amplified is the need to push ahead with European integration and to not be afraid to be bold in that and to talk about it. The US has devoted a lot of military-based support for Ukraine, but that's still only quite a small, element, let's say, of what the Europeans are doing at a social level, a political, military level as well. So there's a reason, I think, for the EU to be confident in voicing that and pushing itself to the negotiating table, because ultimately I think Ukraine's resilience rests on a European future. But, I would say that. Very briefly, everyone's got one sentence, and you can even just say yes or no. Alisher, should Ukraine be given a fast track into the European Union?
Yes, of course, it has to be fast track and should be accelerated just to ensure the peace. And if it's European agreed peace, it can last much longer, because even other foreign ministers, I think of Germany, even said this point.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's an emerging consensus about that. None.
Well, in my mind, yes, but I think realistically, I don't think we can just do that, because it's gonna create a whole lot of mess around the world, and it's gonna get into even more serious context. So
I think that's a well-reasoned answer for sure. Arda, what do you think? Yes or no? Maybe.
Actually, I'm still thinking this answer about the things are so complicated. But maybe I can agree with that.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Now, any peace agreement, any future of the country has to involve the Ukrainian people. This is something that Trump doesn't seem to acknowledge or realise. It's really important. So the last word goes to you as a Ukrainian citizen. What do you think?
I would say, in the context of current situation with war with Russia, EU integration is really important for us, including fast track, because while EU integration alone may not stop the war immediately, however, it strengthens Ukraine, first of all, economically, politically, and military, making us Ukrainians more resilient against current Russian aggression or future, and increasing our chances of a negotiated peace as well, having strong diplomatic support from EU, a part of military one.
I think it makes sense from any angle you look at, but you're right, caution, and we have to have so-called guardrails. I don't like quoting Vance, but there you go. The word guardrails is okay in this context. We'll give him that. So thanks. That brings our podcast to a close. It's important that we have these discussions, and it will be great if we can have another meeting, in a month or so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you've been semester 2. So I'd like to thank all of our guests, all of our contributors. Everyone's done a lot of background thinking and reading. So Oleh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting discussion.
Good way to start the day.
Yeah.
Arda, thank you to you as well.
I'm really glad to hear that. So the topic is quite interesting. So we talked everywhere of the war. I think so.
It was a good debate.
Yeah, I
thank
liked
you.
it.
Alisher, thank you.
Thank you. That was really nice experience. I appreciate that.
And Non, thank you as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
There you go. Thank you all. Thank you so much for listening to Civitas On Air. We cover current and important political and social topics. Our work is produced by researchers and students from Collegium Civitas, together with Radio Palace. Please subscribe to our podcast by visiting your favourite streaming service, like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And do stay tuned for the next episode.